2019 was a special year for me, full of so many great titles that I absolutely love that were unfortunately not really covered by the mainstream. And as we continue my trek into the past, as I go through each and every single year, giving my top 10 for every single one of them, it is time to really dive into 2019 and let you know what my top 10 anime titles was for the year. As usual, if you have a 2019 top list, definitely let me know down in the comments down below. I love hearing from you guys. And I definitely encourage anybody to check out these titles if you have not watched them already. That's the whole point of this entire series, is to really let you guys know some really interesting titles from the past that you may have missed. So without further ado, let me jump into my top 10 anime of 2019. Kicking things off, we have Vinland Saga as my number 10. Now, interestingly enough, this is a series that, despite the fact that about that midpoint of the series, I kind of started dropping away from it, the one thing that kept me going was the fantastic directing work that was done on this series. It was visually beautiful, done by Wit Studio, of course, and had some of the greatest characters that I've seen in anime. For those who don't know, it's essentially a story about Vikings. We follow a kid named Thorfinn, and at some point he goes out on an adventure with his father. And unfortunately, they're ambushed, and Thorfinn finds himself kind of having to follow around this one group that has one guy in the group that he really wants to die. And unfortunately, that becomes like so much focus of the story for a while that for me personally, it did kind of bug me. But at some point, it really starts getting into that particular guy that he wants dead, and all that stuff really grabbed me. It's stuff that really kind of cemented the series as a story that I'm really invested in, and I really want to know where the story goes going forward. Thankfully, we already have a second season announced for this series, and I'm really interested to see where this writer really plans on going with the story, because as I've heard, the first season was technically a prologue. For my number 9, I have Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba, the first season. Yes, I did enjoy this show. And yes, I do acknowledge that a lot of it's because of the animation. Ufotable did some incredible work on this series. As usual, the unlimited budget works factor. But honestly, it was more than that. I really did like the grim and dark nature of this series, despite it being very shonen in flavor. You have the quest of the main character that they're kind of seeking towards, and then you have the big bads that keep showing up over time. You have the training montages and all that other stuff. But what's in the core of it was really likable characters, minus Zenitsu. Zenitsu's probably the one thing that makes me not enjoy the series. But Tanjiro, the main character, is just a character you want to root for. He's just a good boy. All he really wants to do is just help his sister, his last remaining family member, after this big tragedy that happens. And seeing the struggle of Tanjiro, the good nature of himself, and each of these demons that he ends up facing off against is where a lot of the intrigue comes from. This writer has a knack for not really just having a big bad that the good guy takes care of, but actually has some point in which you start to really kind of understand the demon. These are actually people at some point that had some sort of misfortune befall them, and the only thing that they thought that they can turn to at the time was becoming a demon. And I think Tanjiro's ability to really acknowledge that, pretty much because his sister is his prime example of the fact that they were once people, you really do get more than just Tanjiro slays bad guys. And yes, mixing that some incredible action scenes. It's a series that in its second core, I had to get caught up at some point, and I was blown away with what they did in that second core. It's a series that I really enjoyed, visually beautiful, great music. It just has everything going for it. Yes, maybe minus some really kind of twisting, overlining story that will blow your mind. Moving on to my number 8, I have Fruits Basket, the first season. Yes, this is the beginnings of the remake of Fruits Basket. This is an absolute treat of a series, and yes, it should probably be further up in my list, but this is kind of where I end up finding it at, and it deserves to be in my list because it's a series that I absolutely treasure. Now, I watched the original adaptation of it, and I did enjoy it back then. I had a lot of fun with it, but yes, there was this looming issue that the ending didn't really feel right, and that was for a reason. It was because it wasn't adapted all the way through it, and here we go. We have a full readaptation of it, and not only that, but this promise that they were going to do the entire story. And it was actually really fantastic. For those who don't know, it basically follows Torohanda, who pretty much lost her family. At some point, she's living with her grandfather, and she feels like she's a burden upon them, so she decides to pretty much camp out in the middle of a forest. Well, after a mudslide, she finds herself kind of taken care of by this family, the Soma family. As she finds out, the Soma family is a very large family. There's many families within it, and each one of them have an interesting thing about it. The bloodlines of them birth different people of the zodiac sign. And the interesting thing enough is that if these people are in contact with somebody of the opposite sex, they will turn into that zodiac animal. And it's not only that, there's an interesting thing about the Soma family. A head of the Soma family that essentially controls them. There's a curse about them that Toru is kind of learning about over time. And it's really in the good nature of Toru Honda that makes this show. She's just pure of heart, always smiling, and able to bring people out of their darkness. She's like a ray of sunshine. And that's something that kind of emanates from the show as you watch it. It's just so wholesome and so smile-inducing, but at the same time so tragic because you see the terrible things the Soma family is going through. Make no mistake, being a part of the Soma family, while it seems like they're, well off, is a curse. These people are going through terrible things, abuse, struggles, and so many restrictions placed upon them. And seeing how Toru pulls these people out of their darkness, despite the fact that you know that deep inside herself, she has her own darkness that she's really trying to keep hidden, is something that I've always loved about the series, even though it is kind of really hard to watch at times. And now that we've pretty much concluded the series at this point, it's really a treasure. I definitely recommend everybody checking it out. Moving on to my number 7, I have Kaguya-sama Love is War. This is a series that is an absolute treat. And it's so funny because it's a series that it's a comedy romance that you kind of think is going to get old, and it never really does. The whole shtick is that every episode is like segmented skits. Introduces a scene, somebody does something, there's a punchline to it, and then it jumps to the next scene. But it, surprisingly enough, never gets old. It essentially follows Kaguya and Miyuki, and these two are part of the student council. Miyuki is the president of it, and Kaguya is the vice president of it. And the one thing that's established very quickly is the two of these love each other. But unfortunately, the two of them don't want to admit to the other one. It's a game to them. They want the other one to admit it first. They kind of got an idea that the other one loves them, and they just want to get them to admit it first. It's like a pride thing about it. And so it's kind of a cat and mouse game between the two of them and getting the other to confess. And this turns into a lot of fun. And again, surprisingly enough, never gets old. And I think that's because it has such a great supporting cast. Yes, Fujiwara, for one, is definitely a huge addition to it. But again, it's a romance comedy that just never gets old. I love it to death. It's presented so well. It's got a narrator over it the entire time. This is one of those cases where I don't think I would enjoy the manga just because the narrator pulls it off. His voice telling you what kind of unfolded and what to really expect of it is always priceless. And yes, we have another season coming soon. Moving on to my number 6, The Demon Girl Next Door. This is a personal treasure of mine. I think everything beyond this point, besides one, I think are all just kind of personal treasures of mine. But The Demon Girl Next Door is an absolute treat. I love it so much, and I think a lot of it has to do with how well JC Staff did in adapting this series. The action cues, the sound effects, the music, the voice acting, everything just comes together perfectly to make a very adorable and just lovable and just absolutely hilarious series. Now, the premise. This is where it gets me. It follows Yuko, or Shamiko, who is essentially again, demon girl. It opens up kind of laying out that her family is cursed. Many years ago, a magic girl took down her bloodline and cursed them with financial woes. So Shamiko is always dealing with the terrible fact that her family's always poor because the magical girls back then cursed their family. So she's took it upon herself that she's going to rise up, take down this magical girl, and remove this curse from her family. Well, the problem is the magical girl is actually a really nice person. So you have like this just too pure girl trying so hard to be this demon that will take down this magical girl that's super nice that always takes care of her. It's absolutely hilarious. It's so heartwarming. And yeah, it actually gets kind of interesting with this overall story in the later parts of the first season, which definitely has me really excited that we're getting a second season just around the corner. And don't get me started on the fact that her transformation outfit, she absolutely hates wearing it and everybody kind of questions her. It's so good. I love it. I just love Shamiko. She's so adorable. The magical girl is so great. The cast of characters just had me every single episode. I loved it to death. It was a huge surprise hit for me in that particular season that it came out. Moving on to my number 5, I have a huge surprise for me. Now, I cover a lot of shows that are on Netflix, and typically a lot of them are kind of busts. Made to sting more by the fact that Netflix's subscription cost is so insanely high, but there was one exception, and that was Carol and Tuesday. I will admit that I came into Carol and Tuesday fully expecting I wasn't going to like it. Despite the fact that Shinichiro Watanabe was working on it as a director and creator of it, which of course he worked on Cowboy Bebop, just the style and the visual of it just didn't really capture me. But as I watched the show, I found myself absolutely in love with this series. It essentially takes place on Mars, where they've finally terraformed there, and it follows two different girls. Carol, who's kind of a aspiring musician, and Tuesday, who is a runaway, basically. And the two of them end up finding each other and basically starting up a band. They want to make it big and become music stars. And this eventually leads them into joining this America's Got Talent, or Mars Got Talent, I forget exactly what it was called, where they compete against other people, and that's where it kind of really starts opening up. As we see so many different types of musicians, their different styles and everything, and it all comes together with a pretty okay ending. Okay, I will admit that the very end of it was like, okay, yeah, I can see where you go with that, but the journey was great. I loved Carol, I loved Tuesday, I loved really kind of rooting for them every single episode. It was really a huge shock to me. It was a series that I ended up absolutely loving, really because of the characters and the music. The music of this series blew me away. They actually hired a lot of musicians to actually do the music for the show. It wasn't really the voice actors themselves that did it. They actually hired actual professionals. And the music that came out of that was so fantastic. And there was so many different styles of it. There was rap, there was pop, there was so many different that really kind of blew me away. And every single one of the tracks, there was maybe one or two that I was like, but the rest of it I just absolutely loved. And probably the story that I loved the most was around Tao and Angela. They were just an absolutely fantastic story that I really wasn't expecting to like. I highly recommend Carol and Tuesday. I think it ended up being our top pick for Otaku Spirit's best of the year. But yeah, I love it to death. Moving on to my number 4, I have Astra Lost in Space. Now, this is a series that I think there was a lot of back and forth about this series. A lot of people were like, it's predictable. Or some people were saying, no, I actually really like this. I was on the boat of really loving this series. This was a huge hit for me. It essentially follows this group of kids who go on this planet camp where they go off into space together and they end up finding themselves kind of thrown out into the middle of the universe unexpectedly, and they have to find their way back to home. Well, unfortunately, they can't just zip right back home. They actually have to take multiple stops in order to gather resources so they don't starve or die. And there's a few aspects that really made this series great for me. One was the idea of exploring different planets, seeing different types of environments and species that they would end up facing. There's a lot of sense of danger and a lot of suspense kind of built into the idea of surviving this trip. And additionally, it had a little element of who's the mole kind of mixed into the batch. Add into that having a really great cast that I actually really enjoyed, the chemistry I really enjoyed about it. The whole package was just kind of sold to me. There was certain themes kind of presented like hero complexes that typically I don't find interesting, but in this situation, it was really well done. And then top it all off, having a really interesting ending to it that I found really clever and ultimately grabbed me for like the last few episodes. It was a really cool twist that had me really kind of yelling at the top of my lungs for people to check out the series. It's a really fantastic series. I love it to death. Definitely check it out. Moving on to the top 3. It's getting to the neck now. My number 3, I have Beastars. Now, this was a series that I was actually looking forward to. Yes, granted it's CGI, but it had a good style to it. Beastars is basically about a society that's built around the coexisting of both predators and preys. Now, in Beastars, everybody is like a human-beast hybrid. They have legs, they have hands, they walk around like humans, but they obviously have, you know, different animal type features. But as you would expect, having both prey and predators living side by side, there's a little bit of tension there. But it seems like society is trying to keep this peace about it. A predator just can't go out and kill a prey. So how they keep this kind of neutrality is that they have this thing known as a Beastar. It's this beacon of a person that kind of instills this hope that everybody will keep this structure going. And a lot of the focus goes around Legoshi, and he is a wolf, so obviously a predator. And a lot of the first season is him having this run-in with his bunny and his instincts kicking in and that little fear that he has about controlling himself. And in the background, you have the death of somebody that was obviously caused by a predator. So while you have this societal neutrality kind of created, kind of the structure itself being shook, you do have a lot of focus around the Beastar and kind of ensuring that structure that was already built. A lot of my love around this series is around the characters. They're just fantastic characters, and I love this kind of exploration of the senses and that internal instincts that these people are constantly fighting and how that switch can obviously be hit. It's a fascinating look into an interesting take on human society from a beast-like perspective. Moving on to my number 2. I know this is going to be probably the most obscure one out of the entire list, but I absolutely loved this show, and that's Babylon. For those who don't know about Babylon, it's essentially about this district that's trying to seek autonomy. And as it does that, it tries to enact a new rule upon this district, and that is the right to death. They essentially want to legalize you ending your own life. And obviously a lot of people are kind of shocked by this. But there's obviously a lot of people that are like, if that's your choice, that's your choice. A lot of people are suffering and they want to choose that. But it doesn't just end there. As we really start seeing people losing their lives, a lot of questions are coming up as to if they actually had that choice. There's a looming interest in if people are being controlled or manipulated in order to push some sort of personal interest. And we follow Zen, who is an investigator, and we basically follow his team as they're trying to figure out what these political leaders are doing, who this new upcoming political leader, and what is his actual goal, and possibly what kind of strings are being pulled in the background. As obviously there's a lot of political groups pushing weight upon their investigation. They're not able to do exactly what they want to do, but there is an interesting element behind the scenes that they do want to uncover. And what this turns into is an absolutely riveting, suspenseful game of cat and mouse that I was hooked on from the very, very beginning. You're essentially dealing with death and possible manipulation that people might not be aware of. And seeing how that unfolds over time and the mental destruction that kind of has with the characters, I loved it to death. It was probably one of the very few suspenseful thrillers in anime that I was absolutely hooked the moment it starts really ramping up. And yes, it has probably one of the most unsettling villains I've seen in anime history. Now, I'm a little bit up in the air of the ending. It's kind of left up to a little bit of a question mark, but I think a lot of the theorizing that happened with that ending really did have me fascinated. I really did love kind of picking it apart and really giving my thoughts on exactly how I felt it ended. It was a thrill. I loved it to death, and I highly recommend people check out Babylon. It is an absolute treasure that unfortunately I think got lost in the fact that it was on Amazon at the time. All right, it's time for my number one favorite anime of 2019. Yes, the number one, numero uno. And that is Mirror Tights. Yes, Mirror Tights was, oh my gosh, I absolutely love this series. It was so good. Now, unfortunately, it's a short, but I think what they did with that short, with that little bracket of time they were given, it was pure gold. I mean, what's better than Tights? I'm joking, obviously. It was a good show, though. No, my number one goes to A Sentence of a Bookworm. Yes, it's an obvious one. If you've ever listened to me long enough, if you've ever watched my videos long enough, you know I absolutely love A Sentence of a Bookworm. This is an isekai that is doing so many things that you just never see in isekai. I think calling it an isekai is an insult because it's so much more than that. It's not the summon of an isekai, but an actual experience of an isekai that I think is absolutely a treasure. For those unfamiliar with the series, it essentially follows a bookworm who one day finds herself transported into the body of a girl named Mine. And while most isekais, they have superpowers, they're overpowered, or they have just a big harem, or they go off to save the world, they have to take down the demon lord, this is a lot more simpler. This is a girl who's just transported into a very poor family, a family in the commoners area of this kingdom. Not given much, their family's struggling to kind of keep themselves happy. But the interesting thing around the body that she's placed in is actually somebody who was already alive, who had a life in this world. And again, her name was Mine. But we find out very quickly Mine was deathly ill. She wasn't able to move around on her own. Even as she is placed into this body of this girl, she still has that inability to really kind of move around on her own. She struggles. She's very weak. She's frail. I even speculated early on that I believe that the girl that she's placed inside of died that day. So a lot of the story is around the idea of appreciating what you have. But not only that, but around the idea of this girl being isekai'd, wanting to, because she was a bookworm, she wants to find a book. She wants to read a book. But she's a commoner. They don't have books here. All the books are for the nobles, those that have mana. And so this begins her venture to try to create her own book. She just wants to hold a book. And the way that she's kind of doing this is, yes, introducing the concepts of creating books into this world, but also in bringing the knowledge that she had from the previous world into this world in order to essentially make her life a little more easier. Mine is a great character. I love her to death. And I think another thing that kind of makes this series so great is the cast is so fantastic. I love Mine. I think she's a fantastic character. I love her family, how heartwarming they are and supportive of each other, and just really trying to make the best of their life. And additionally, as it goes along, meeting Lutz, her childhood friend of this world, the people she meets through trade, and eventually the church that they get into with the second season. It's a fantastic series that I just absolutely love to death. I love the fact that it got a second season. I'm so happy that we have a third season around the corner that I hope that you'll all join me in watching. But yes, Ascendance of Bookworm goes down as easily one of my favorite isekais of all time, and easily the #1 anime of 2019. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this run through of 2019, or maybe this run through nostalgia if you enjoyed anime during that time. Again, I welcome everybody to go down in the comments down below and let me know what your favorite anime of 2019 was. And I hope that if you haven't already, you'll consider subscribing, as I will be doing further treks back in time as we go through 2018, 2017, 2016, all those years, giving my top 10 picks of every single year until I just can't find anything in that year that I watched or enjoyed. But as always, additionally, if you want to support us, we have a Patreon and a tips link in the description below. We definitely appreciate everybody that considers. Also, there's a link to our Discord. If you enjoy anime and want to talk about it, come jump in there and talk with me. As always, I thank you all for watching, and y'all take care. That is going to take 5 hours to edit.